GD, and welcome back to Crack on the Coast, where we bring the stories, the heritage, and the heart of Ireland's people from the wild Atlantic way to the Celtic coast right to your ears. I'm your host, Michael Schilling, joined as always by my co host, Shaun Morgan. Today's episode takes us to Derry, a city that has carried both the pain and the perseverance of Ireland's modern history. On January 30th, 1972, British paratroopers opened fire on unarmed civil rights marchers in the Bogside, killing 13 people that day and another who later died of his wounds. What became known as Bloody Sunday sent shockwaves through Ireland and the world, deepening the conflict and forever altering the relationship between Derry's people and the British state. For more than 50 years, the families of those killed have sought justice through tribunals, inquiries, and most recently, the trial of Soldier F, one of the paratroopers involved. That trial has now concluded with a verdict that has left many questioning what justice truly means a half a century later.
And to help us make sense of that verdict and what it means for the families for Derry and for Ireland, we're joined by a friend of the Father John Murphy division, whose voice has long carried the conscience of that city. Don Mullan is a native of Derry, and as a 16-year-old witnessed the events of Bloody Sunday firsthand. His landmark book, Eyewitness Bloody Sunday, published in 1997, reignited the campaign that led to the Saville Inquiry and ultimately the 2010 apology from then British Prime Minister David Cameron, who called the killings unjustified and unjustifiable. Since then, Don has become an international advocate for both truth and reconciliation, working on human rights causes around the world. Don, we're honoured to have you on Craic on the Coast, and for those listening who might only know the headlines, could you start by sharing what Bloody Sunday represented, both to Derry and to you personally as someone who lived through it?
Well, thank you, Shaun, and thank you, Michael, for the invitation to join you on your podcast. I'm really glad to be here. I was actually a 15-year-old schoolboy on Bloody Sunday, and it was my first civil rights march. And we never expected what actually transpired that day. In fact, when we gathered in the Bishop's Field in the Craic, where I was born and grew up, there was almost like a carnival atmosphere. And the reason being is that the civil rights organizers, had gone to both the official and the provisional IRA and had got guarantees from them that they would stay away. So they were pretty confident that this was going to pass off peacefully, and that the march would make a point and the speeches would make a point, and that would be ended and people would go home. Um, the one worrying element was the fact that it was decided to draft in the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, who were quite notorious and who we now know, were engaged in, smaller but equally brutal massacres in Belfast the summer before. And they had been drafted in to deal with a march near McGilligan internment camp, about 20 miles from Derry. And the organizers had decided to have this particular demonstration on the beach because there was less chance that there was going to be stones available to throw at the soldiers or whatever. But they were very viciously attacked. And John Hume was particularly concerned, and in fact, he suggested that maybe it might not be a good idea to go ahead with the march on the 30th of January, 1972, and he stayed away. But the other marchers decided, the organizers decided to go ahead, which they did. And I remember there was really good humor in the march as we made our way through the streets of the Craigan, through the Brandywell, then towards the Bogside as it was growing bigger and bigger. Up to 20,000 people joined the march that particular day, which was huge. But as we got to William Street, we could see then the military on side streets. So the march became quieter at that stage. And the plan was to turn right on Roswell Street and go onto Free Derry Corner for the demonstration or for the speeches. Some people, including myself, marched down to make a point at the barricade because originally the plan was to go to the Guildhall, which was the civic centre of the town. And but the march had been banned and barricades were put up. So there were altercations there, but they were quite minor, and most people began to pull away and make their way towards Free Derry Corner, and I did that as well. I was walking just past the rubble barricade when I heard a commotion behind me, and I looked and I could see hundreds of people running in my direction and running to the right of the Roswell Flats. And I could see then lorries and Saracens making their way in, and some soldiers on foot as well. And then suddenly the shooting began. And it was amazing, at first people were in shock and were even kind of standing looking what was happening. But the most vivid memory I have of Bloody Sunday was the sound of Michael Kelly, who was 2 feet, 2.5 feet to my left. And I remember him going, "Ugh," and he gasped and he fell at my feet, and he had been shot by Soldier F, whom we're going to discuss later on. And then other people to my right on the barricade fell. And I remember at a certain point a bullet hitting the gable end of a wall above my head, just on the corner, and it was like the brick burst and bits of brick and mortar kind of came around us. At which point, then I realized this is serious, and like a survival instinct kicked in. And the last thing I remember was someone shouting, get down, they're firing live ammunition." And after that, I have no memory for the next 3 minutes, until I've ascended steep steps onto Beechwood Avenue, which is maybe a half a mile away. And a woman said something was happening, and I looked at her and I said, "Mrs., there must be at least 6 people dead." I have no idea why I said that. And she looked at me in disbelief, but I didn't stop to try and convince her. And I was clearly, like, a primeval instinct had taken over me. I was running home to safety. And that evening, of course, we realized that not 6, but 13 people had been shot dead and 14 had been wounded, one of whom who died a few weeks later of his injuries. So I remember the next day my best friend Shawnee coming to my house, and we went back to retrace our steps. And I remember going and telling him what I'd seen at the barricade. I can remember 6 bullet holes in one of the windows in the Roswell Flats, and they had been fired at an Italian photographer called Fulvio Grimaldi, who was trying to photograph bodies on the barricade. And he had a girlfriend called Susan North, and she actually was making an Englishwoman. She had a handheld recorder. So to listen to the sound of those bullets coming into that room and the terror in the room as well is very, very dramatic. And then we went over across the road and we found the blue and white civil rights banner that had led our march the day before. And it was now heavily bloodstained because it had been used to cover the body of Barney McGuigan, another man who was murdered by Soldier F. And I remember, the congealed blood, because when Barney fell, he shot him from behind. The bullet went in underneath his left ear and it exited just above his right eye. And when Barney fell, his head ran like a top, and there's a photograph almost like a lake of blood around Barney to the right hand side of his body. And on top of the bloodstained civil rights banner, I remember there was a brick. This is how vivid I have this memory. And on the brick was an open Bo Peep matchbox. And in the matchbox was a human eyelid and eyelashes that someone had picked up and put there. Um, and then in terms of my book, which is really interesting, is if a little while later, Shawnee and I were walking and we met a guy called Murray Gormley, who was a bit older than us, but he was also the assistant manager of a football team. And Shawnee got me to tell Murray what I had witnessed. And Murray said, "Don, they're taking eyewitness statements up in the Holy Child Primary School in the Craic, and I think you should go and give a statement." Now, that was one of the most important things that anybody ever told me to do. And indeed, Shawnee and Murray walked me up, and I gave my little statement. It's a very simple statement, but the important thing is that it proves historically that I was there. And it was that simple statement, almost 25 years later, that became the basis of my book. And, the book itself became a primary catalyst for what became the longest running and most expensive inquiry in British legal history. What really was horrendous about Bloody Sunday was that almost immediately the British Army began to disseminate lies. We hear a lot about fake news. Well, this is when we really experienced fake news, in a very personal way, because they told the media and the world that as they moved into the bauxite, they came under a fuselage of bombs and bullets, that they fired back at targeted gunmen and bombers. And indeed, they added to that the next day at the British consulate in New York by saying that also some of those who were shot were on the Army's wanted list, all of which were lies. All of which were lies. Um, the day after Bloody Sunday, we learned in secret minutes, which I have reproduced in the Eyewitness Bloody Sunday. We have the secret minutes of a meeting between Prime Minister Heath, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, Lord Widgery. He was the highest judicial figure, and he was asked to conduct a public inquiry because there was an outcry, because this happened in broad daylight, and it just didn't happen in front of the the Derry community. It happened in front of many media people as well, like many journalists who said the army's uh, story is not what we witnessed. And so there was real pressure on the British government to have a public inquiry. But in the actual minutes, it's recorded that the Prime Minister reminded the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales that we are in Northern Ireland not only fighting a military war, but a propaganda war. So he's clearly giving the Lord Chief Justice a steer in terms of the desired outcome of the inquiry. And our community cooperated with that inquiry. The statement that I gave and hundreds of other citizens gave, were typed up and were presented to help him. But he dismissed them, saying that they arrived too late, and he used some of the statements to show that there were inconsistencies and characteristics to justify him not using them. And in the end, in less than 3 months, he found the innocent guilty and the guilty innocent. Now, Shaun and Michael, you've got to understand then the consequences of this. Our community had cooperated with the British inquiry, and in the end, they served up a whitewash. So the decision by many young men and women that there's no such thing as British justice, therefore we will fight fire with fire, and therefore to join the IRA, in many respects, it was logical. And what they did was they killed the non-violent civil rights movement, and they handed the initiative over to the men of violence on all sides. And it took nearly 25 years for us to catch up and to have this wrong somewhat put right. Not entirely, but somewhat put right.
Right. So, thank you, Don. I know that's very in-depth, recollection. I'm sure with everything going on lately, it's something that you've had to talk about more than once. I know I appreciate you doing it with us, but now going into, here we stand, and the verdict comes out, on Soldier F. And according to the judge, he ruled that it failed to meet the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt, but he also did not hold back with regards to making comments about how the men should hold their heads low, and all sense of military discipline was lost. He did condemn it morally, but what does that paradox reveal about the level of justice and the level of accountability that can actually happen at this point with regards to Soldier F
Yeah.
and everybody else.
I did an interview when the case opened in Belfast about a month ago, and I actually said at the end, "It will not surprise me if he gets off."
Oh,
And he got off on a technicality. And what we have to emphasize here is that not guilty in this case does not mean innocence.
correct.
And he was not found innocent. He was found on this technicality not guilty because it didn't meet what the judge considered were the required kind of parameters. But what I did immediately then, because some people were texting me and saying, "Oh, he's got off. He's been found not guilty," and I says, "No." I says, "He's off on a technicality," but I says, "Let me read to you what the Saville Inquiry found in relation to this man, and let me just, you know, uh, read it to you here, and for the purpose of your listeners as well. The summary of Saville's finding on Soldier F. This is the man who was found not guilty. So the second Bloody Sunday Inquiry Report 2010 identified Soldier F of the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment as responsible for multiple unlawful killings and woundings on Bloody Sunday, 30th of January 1972. Specifically, Michael Kelly, shot and killed by Soldier F as he stood near the Roswell Flats rubble barricade. That's Michael Kelly, who was very close to me when he fell. William McKinney, killed by shots fired by Soldier F. Jim Ray, killed by Soldier F, who fired 2 shots at him as he lay wounded on the ground. You've got to understand, Jim Ray was already wounded, and eyewitnesses are very clear. He was trying to raise himself up and he couldn't because the lower half of his body, was incapacitated. And Joe Mahan, who was pretending to be dead, he was wounded lying beside Jim Ray. And but from the side of his eye, he saw Soldier F walk past Jim Ray and, like, with his gun, just went 2 shots in the back. I mean, an execution of a wounded man, which also was in violation of the Geneva Convention. And then he went on to kill other people. Now, Patrick Doherty, probably shot and killed by Soldier F as he attempted to crawl to safety in the Roswell Flats courtyard. Barney McGuigan, this is the man I told you about. Barney was taking shelter at a red telephone kiosk with a small group of people, including a paramedic. And out in the forecourt of the Roswell Flats was Patrick Doherty, the man that Saville just referred to there. And he was shot and dying by Soldier F, but he was calling over to the people at the kiosk, "I'm dying, I'm shot, please help me, please help me." And on a couple of occasions, Barney McGuigan went to help him, but there was so much shooting, people remonstrated with him, says, "Barney, it's too dangerous, wait, 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 until the shooting stops." But still, Paddy was pleading for someone to come to him. And eventually, Barney McGuigan couldn't take it anymore. And so he reached into his pocket, he pulled out his handkerchief, and cowering over, using the handkerchief to show that, he was no threat to anyone, he began to slowly and in a very non-threatening way make his way to help Paddy Doherty. And we know that Soldier F saw him, got down on one knee, took him in his sights, and shot him through the head from behind. I mean, it again was a callous murder. And then Michael Quinn probably shot and wounded by Soldier F. Joe Mahan probably shot and wounded by Soldier F. Patrick O'Donnell probably shot and wounded by Soldier F. So this guy is far from innocent, And so one possibility now is that he and one of the soldiers that they were trying to use as a means of declaring him guilty was a soldier H. And one of the technical problems with soldier H was that he had already been found guilty of perjury.
Mm.
So soldier F's legal team were arguing, well, this man's a liar. We can't rely on his testimony, right? So that was part of the technicality here. Uh, but both he and soldier F both have been found to have perjured himself before the first Bloody Sunday inquiry, and I think certainly in the case of soldier F, in the second Bloody Sunday inquiry. So now they're looking at the possibility of maybe pursuing them on the basis of perjury. Now, it's interesting. I spoke to a journalist yesterday, and he said, you look at old German Nazis, who are being pursued now in old age, and like sometimes they're they've got oxygen masks on, and you wonder, should they be pursued at this stage? Should they just let it go? And he was wondering, should the same thing happen in terms of Bloody Sunday? And I said, well, first of all, you've got to remember, we were pursuing these guys from day one. And it's taken us 53 years, to actually get them into a court of law. So it's not as if we waited for 53 years to actually to get to this point. But I said we've been fought all the way by the British system, who were intent on saving these guys' necks. And I also said, what the Bloody Sunday families have done is really important, like not just for the people of Derry, but also for the people of the world, because I mean, and you can see it in Gaza. There are soldier Fs out there all the time, you know, who are sniping, who are killing innocent people, and so on. And they are relying on the belief that they're immune from prosecution because their governments or the state whom they represent will actually cover them from being charged. And so that's why, what the Bloody Sunday families have done is really, really important, because, we've got to give a message out to all the other soldier Fs in the world that, justice will one day catch up on you and you will be made accountable. And the one other thing as well, I made the point, is that this idea, it's a long time and, let it go, and they're old men. And I said, but hold on a second, you've got to also understand these murders were committed by agents of the British state, technically on their own citizens. And I said, like, I know that people in my community did do wrong. I mean, and some of the atrocities. I mean, I had this conversation with Martin McGuinness, I remember, and I said, Martin, there are things that the IRA did which were wrong. And he said, yeah, they were, Don. And he agreed. And the same in terms of the loyalist community. But it's not as if my community was allowed off scot-free. People from my community served over 100,000 plus actual years in prison for troubles-related offences. In the loyalist community, 60,000 plus actual years in prison for troubles-related offences during those 30 years of the conflict. Only 4 British soldiers were ever convicted, and between them, they served no more than just over 15 years, all of whom were released early after campaigns on their behalf, some of which were supported by former British Secretaries of State for Northern Ireland, and despite the seriousnesses of their crimes, were not only allowed back into the British Army, but were promoted. So what does that tell us in terms of how Irish lives are valued before British law and the British state.
Right. And you touched on it. I mean, one quote that I had took note of that the judges stated was the idea that the verdict was a byproduct of the passage of time. That it's just time had faded, memories had faded, evidence was incomplete, and it really all does come down to, as you stated, Don, not the idea that there wasn't inquiries, but the fact that it was all that information was suppressed and it was stretched out as long as it has been so that you're not going to be able to compile all the evidence that they might have been able to if an inquiry to that level wasn't done truthfully back when everything first occurred.
Yes, Michael.
Yeah.
And and what also really important is that when it was announced that there was going to be a second Bloody Sunday inquiry, the British Ministry of Defence had Bloody Sunday weapons, including the one used by Soldier F, destroyed. So they destroyed the evidence,
Mhm.
which again meant that the family's lawyers were, in a sense, going into a fight with one arm tied behind their back. Yeah. So the
Yeah, that's
duplicity that we had to deal with was quite extraordinary over those years.
yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of the tragedy is the state obstruction has caused the delay, and it's the state obstruction is a reason conviction can't be secured. But on the flip side, the families are showing their persistence for over 50 years,
Incredible.
while the institutions responsible for justice have shown their avoidance to it. So, the question becomes, how does Britain stand on a world stage and move forward and put themselves out there as a leader of justice and to criticize other nation states and their actions? We can talk Gaza and what's going on there.
Yeah.
If they're not willing to take responsibility for its roles in creating these delays and stopping families from receiving justice for so long.
Yeah. I'm looking at Tony Blair sitting, with Donald Trump and others now in terms of this new committee to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza. And you're thinking, like Bishop Desmond Tutu described him and George W. Bush as war criminals because of the second Iraq war, which was predicated on lies. The lies which were created, by the way, by Netanyahu, which was the lies of weapons of mass destruction. And despite the fact that the United Nations were saying we need more time, we haven't found anything, and so on, they overran that and they put together this coalition of the willing and went in. And I mean, I remember, there was a former British paratrooper, not in the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, but he had served in the Parachute Regiment, and he acted in the movie Bloody Sunday that my book inspired, directed by Paul Greengrass. So I became quite friendly with that man. And I remember him saying to me that he had guys who were on their way to Iraq, and many of them were saying, we're not even sure, you know, if this war is justified. It's
Mhm.
very interesting. So, I mean, I think that Britain's credibility anyway is always very circumspect, even in terms of, I mean, just to think about, going back to 1948 and this huge expulsion of Palestinian people. And you know that the famous black and tans, after they were removed from Ireland, where did they go? They went to Palestine. It was known as kind of Palestine's little Ulster.
Mhm.
And, so it's sometimes if you didn't laugh, you would cry in terms of the tragedy of it.
Yeah. I will say this, and this will go into the third part of the conversation is that how the families represented themselves after the verdict.
Yes.
It was amazing the strength to get up
Yeah.
there and have the wherewithal to say it's not the judge's fault. that they know where the fault lies, but to keep their composure the way they did after the
Yeah.
verdict, it's just I don't know how you do it, but they
Yeah,
keep
I actually wasn't in Belfast for it, but I rang John Kelly, who has been one of the stalwarts, and I spoke to him, and he says, "Ah, sure, Don, we're not surprised, you know," but he says, "It's not over." But you're absolutely right, Michael. I mean, it was my privilege to work with the Bloody Sunday families in terms of, putting together the book, uh, and in terms of the campaign that led to the new inquiry and throughout that inquiry. And like what really was amazing was their dignity and their strength of character and their unwillingness to give up uh, until their loved ones was that their innocence was declared before the world. And that's the other thing as well. This book, I mean, I compiled it, but this is a community book, you know, and I put in here 100 eyewitness statements of 600. Originally, I was thinking of doing all 600, but in the end, I thought, people won't sustain it because, and I mean this actually not as a criticism, and I mean it in a very respectful way. It would have been boring because the eyewitnesses were saying the same thing over and over and over again.
mm,
So in choosing 100 for this book, I also made sure I told people if you want to access the other 500 or so, this is where you'll find them, you know? Uh, but the power of this is that you cannot get a community to agree on a collective lie. Otherwise, it'll fall apart, you know?
right.
Whereas, like, these eyewitness statements and whoever had the genius to actually get people to put their memories down immediately, you know, uh, they're the ones who set in motion what 25 years later would be an earthquake that forced the British government to set aside Widgery and historically create a new and a second inquiry, which was necessary as well as part of the peace process. And I think the people of Derry as well have been very staunch in their support of the families. And so yeah, it was extraordinary how Bloody Sunday was a trauma, but it also brought people very closely together.
I mean, it's processing it all, still going through. After the verdict, what does moving forward mean for the families, do you think? I mean, I'm gonna say this wrong. I'm not gonna say, is the energy still there for a legal fight, but how does this continue? I mean, we're 50 years removed. Are we looking at another 50 years and this becomes a generational legacy that's carried on?
No, it's a good point, and Sean, some of the families were content with the conclusions that the Saville Inquiry came to, and also the statement actually, which no one expected, like from Prime Minister Cameron at the time, when he described the events of Bloody Sunday as unjustified and unjustifiable. And apart from like one of the deads, whom Saville, Jerry Dunny, left doubts hanging over him in relation to nail bombs. Um, Everyone else was completely exonerated. So some of the families are happy with that, and don't really uh, play a role any further. Um, but John Kelly and the McKinneys and the Rays and the Duddies and some others, the Nashes, they're determined in different ways to pursue it. There are some of the families who've kept on the annual march, uh, while other families would prefer the march, stopped. Uh, but their legal teams are certainly look at the possibility now of pursuing these guys on the basis of perjury.
Mm,
And if they are found guilty of perjury, you know, then in some ways that totally eviscerates also the not guilty that was found in Belfast last week, you know. So yeah, there's still energy, but you can see they're old as well. We're none of us are young anymore. Um, but what's amazing as well, even in Derry, like I mean, on Free Derry Corner, you'll see like lots of colors related to the Palestinian struggle and so on. But they talk about, like one struggle, one world. So in other words, like what we're fighting for is also the struggle of people suffering oppression all over the world. So I mean, that was one of the things that I learned, like, as a young person, in terms of many of the campaigns that I work on today as well, all began back there, because I mean, when Bloody Sunday happened, immediately we were making comparisons, in terms of the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa or the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and so it was natural that we made those connections, and so um, the Bloody Sunday families and people like myself, we're looking out for other people who are suffering injustice as well. And if we can help them and support them and encourage them and share our experience and knowledge, then we're only just too happy to do that.
Well, and I was just gonna say, I mean, you've taken the story of Bloody Sunday far beyond Derry to, as you just said, Don, to more global situations. And from your perspective, there's obviously lessons um, that Bloody Sunday still holds. I mean, we're talking Gaza, but there's other anywhere where people are kind of downtrodden by a state government that, like you said, that they have no accountability because they control the whole situation. And that's so it is important for you've made the comment, I think I've heard you make the comment before about a moral duty to remember. And I think that's important. That is a great statement.
Yeah, that was in relation to the great famine, and putting famine in inverted commas because it wasn't a famine, in the 19th century. And there were some who saw the potential of it being a great anti-British project, and I said, no, that's not the motivation. You know, if we believe what happened to our people, during the so-called Great Famine was an injustice, then we have a moral imperative arising out of that memory to be energized to help other people who are suffering the same injustices today. So it's the same application in terms of Bloody Sunday as well, you
Uh,
know. Um,
So then pivoting away a little bit, so Don, you've had, you know, 50 years of advocacy, documentation, storytelling related to this. And there is an aspect, history repeating itself over and over again. We see events like this happening. You talked about
mm.
My Lai, etc. Like we keep coming back to Gaza. What gives you hope today? I mean, what tells you that, and there has to be justice in some form, and it's something that has to be fought for, even when, the apparatus of states fall short and don't bring justice to people.
Well, it's ordinary people who give me a lot of hope, Sean, and there's more goodness in the world than there is badness, and I'll be in New York in 2 weeks' time, and I'll be staying with David Turashik,
mm,
whom you hosted.
yep.
And like, there's a man who was born, a British journalist, and yet he's a man of incredible integrity and amazing goodness in him, and you meet someone like David, and I think when I go back to the United States as well, and I won't get into American politics other than making a comment, what breaks my heart today is how words have divided people. It used to be, if there was an election, yeah, there were registered Democrats and there were registered Republicans, and you would have your rivalry up to the point of the election, and then nobody ever disputed, You get on with it then and you get on with your lives and you still could be friends. But now it's almost like you have to be sworn enemies, and some of the language being used is very inflammatory and very worrying, and I would just love to see I hope maybe this American-born Pope might be able to play a role of maybe bringing the American people together again, and democracy is the great hope of humanity.
Mhm.
And next year be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Certainly, America is not a perfect democracy, but it also was an important democracy with some really, really important people coming out of it. And God, the world cannot afford to lose American democracy. So I'm just hoping that we can see somehow American people coming together again.
Right. I will say this, as you made the comment about the new pope, it's nice to hear comments, and I've heard this from other people as of late that are and, with regards to our organization, about how it really is on us to be able to show dignity to everyone, no matter where they come from or what race they are, or if you would disagree with them or not. But it's just the idea of showing every human being the dignity that they deserve. And I think
I com-
that's a really, really powerful statement right now in our current world climate.
yeah,
So
I completely agree with you, Michael, and it's wrong that in a sense poor and vulnerable people are used as the scapegoats.
uh,
And I've made the point, that if you stop and talk to a refugee, I mean, we're having the mutation of some of the things that are happening in the United States happening in Ireland,
uh,
and protests and riots, and some of them very serious, like outside, like a hotel just last week where many Ukrainian refugees
yes.
are receiving protection. And if you stop and ask these people like the stories of how they got here, and the courage that it took, and they're not unlike the reasons why our people fled Ireland, in the 19th century.
Hmm.
And they were the poorest, and we let's not forget that in New York and Boston there was no Irish and blacks need apply.
Right.
So I that's why I just think that many Irish people do have big hearts, but it's unconscionable if we turn on poor people.
Yep.
During 9/11, uh, I remember one of the commanders of the fire service. They were in one of the atriums, and every now and again you could hear a thud on the roof, and it was a body hitting it.
Mhm.
And I remember he made the point, how bad must it be up there when the better option is to jump,
Right.
you know? And I often think about a mother taking her kids into a flimsy boat in the hope of reaching a shore that might give them, a better chance of surviving and
Surviving. Yeah.
thriving, you
Yeah, that's
know?
that's one thing that we've talked at our AOH events that we host for, we have a commemoration every year for a shipwreck that occurred in the 1840s, and that's one thing that we always talk about is that, yeah, a lot of people did come here for the promise of a better life, but a lot of people came here just out of survival because
Yeah,
they knew they would not have lived, and that's yeah. Well, Don,
yeah,
I will say this has definitely been a very powerful conversation. I think it's something that our listeners need to hear so that they get perspective. Perspective and means a lot right now, and getting the right perception of what justice will be in this case. versus, as you said, not guilty does not mean innocent. And I think that's really important for everybody to understand that. And I think one thing that I've kind of deferred to is I take a lot in what the families say and how they respond. And they didn't respond with anger. And I
Mm,
think that's, again, I'm very respectful and impressed by
yeah,
how they've conducted themselves during
they're
this
the real
process.
heroes in all of this.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. And,
Okay.
Sean, just one last comment, before we conclude, and that is a conversation I had with Bishop Edward Daly. He's the priest, carrying the cross here, and
Mm,
or the handkerchief in front of Jackie Duddy. But in a conversation with him, he said to me, he said, what happened after Bloody Sunday was even worse than what happened on the day. And what he meant was, the cover up set in motion a whole chain of events that led to 30 years of horrendous violence at times.
mm,
And so these guys are not just responsible for the deaths of the people on Bloody Sunday, but they also, in a sense, were the ignition for a fire that that consumed us like for 30 years. So they have a lot more blood on their hands than just Bloody Sunday,
yeah,
as does the British state as well, for not, allowing, the moral arc, to bend towards justice at the time.
sure. Well, you made the comment about how it pushed people that were trying to do everything through a peaceful means. It pushed them towards violence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Mm.
it.
Well, again, Don, thank you, not just for joining us today, but also obviously your lifelong dedication to truth and human dignity. The story of Bloody Sunday remains a wound, but also a testament to the courage and perseverance to the families who never gave up, and to voices like yours that ensure that we all remember. What I would tell all of our listeners is you can learn more about Don's work at donmullan.org and find his book, Eyewitness Bloody Sunday, wherever books are sold. It is a great read, and the accounts are powerful. We'll also link recent coverage from the verdict in our show notes, so people will have access to that after they're done here. I just want to say thank you again, Don, for coming on today.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to Sean. I know he's gone, but my
Yeah,
best
he's got
to both.
he does he works in education at UMass Boston, so sometimes his schedule is kind of tight knit. But
Yeah,
he
yeah, yeah.
said he apologized for having to jump off early.
No problem. I hope to be back in Boston now, sometime early in the new year, so maybe we'll meet again.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
One
absolutely.
quick note for our listeners before we totally shut it down is our annual AOH food drive in support of our Hibernian Hunger Project is coming up on Saturday, November 8th from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. at Market Basket in North Plymouth. We'll be handing out lists of the most requested food items to help guide donations, things such as canned goods, pasta, cereal, peanut butter, and for the first time, because of a growing need and requests. We're also going to accept diaper donations of all sizes on that day as well. If you'd like to lend a hand that day, happy to welcome volunteers. Just send us a message on our Instagram at AOH Plymouth or at Crack on the Coast. And as always, your generosity and participation make a real difference, especially at this time of year. Um, so I would just like to say that's it for this episode of Crack on the Coast. Thanks for tuning in. And if you'd enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, share it with a friend. And if you've got a story to tell or a topic you'd like us to cover, you can email us at crackonthecoast@gmail.com. That's CRAIC on the coast at gmail.com. Thank you very much, everybody. Slán.